pray. All right, let's pray. Father, thank you for the privilege of hearing Joe's testimony. And it's the grace of God just coming through loudly and clearly, and the direction of the Spirit of God, and using humble, willing servants of God. And it's a good reminder to us to be willing to be used as vessels, as channels through whom you can touch lives with the truth. Thank you for that testimony in the early church as well. And as we talk about chapter 16 and into 17 today, I pray that the Spirit of God would accomplish his plan and purpose for each one of us. I pray in Jesus' name, amen. All right, well, we ended at this slide, and this is a story with which all of you are quite familiar, the jailer. One of the things you have to keep in mind is that typically in that context, the jailer would live in a little apartment, probably either right next to or even connected to the jail. And that way, if anything happened, he'd be there, he could hear things, and had to be close by. And that's what happened here, and that's why it was so easy for Paul to talk to him, and why he showed up at a moment's notice when the earthquake took place. And again, when he says, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" you have to understand that there is some context there. This guy has had some prior contact with the gospel. Paul's been preaching in the city. Remember the slave girl that was following them around for several days? So somewhere along the line, this guy got word of the gospel. In fact, I'm going to guess that a good part of the city had some notion of what was going on. And then this very well-known statement, "Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and you'll be saved, you and your household." Remember when John wrote his gospel, he concluded by saying, "I have written these things that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and believing you might have life through his name." And that is the message. They've been preaching the gospel. They've been talking about the resurrection. The resurrection has been the number one stumbling block to the Jews. The idea that this guy that they crucified has risen from the dead and has ascended into heaven is nonsense to them. But the Spirit of God did get through to some people, and that included the jailer and his family. So they spoke the word to him, which seems to indicate that they explained more to him. And that same hour of the night, this jailer took a risk. Okay, he really got himself potentially in trouble here, because to take a prisoner into his house and treat him the way that he did would have been against the law, and he could have gotten in hot water for doing that. But he washed their stripes. And who are they, by the way? Who's in his house? Paul and Silas. Where are Luke and Timothy, the other two members of their party? We don't know. They're sleeping somewhere as a guest in someone's house, okay? All right. And so immediately he and all his family were baptized. Obviously, his family embraced the gospel as well. They're baptized immediately. Is there already a church in Philippi? Well, there's a contingency of believers, because already many have come to the faith. And so this man and his family will now become part of that new group. And so not only did he wash their stripes, but he fed them, okay, took care of them. Now, does that mean that they didn't have to go back to jail? No. The narrative makes it very clear that they did have to go back into the prison, okay? But notice they were believing, all of their household. The fact that Paul and Silas came to Christ doesn't mean that the jailer, had to let them go, okay? He was still under oath as a jailer to fulfill his duty, and he did. In fact, Paul and Silas wouldn't have wanted it any other way. Here's how we know they went back to jail, because the next day the big shots, remember magistrates is a word where we get our word stratego or strategic, and these were the big guys, and they said, "Let these men go." By the way, just for what it's worth, when you go back to Acts chapter 4, remember that the captain of the temple showed up when things started to get hot in the city. That title, captain of the temple, is the same title for magistrates. He was a stratego as well, the Jewish temple captain. And that's the title given to these guys here as well. So they send the little shots, and this is a word that only appears here in this passage twice, officers. They're like the street police or whatever. They're not invested with the same power as the strategos are. And so they come to prison the next day, and they decide to let him go. Why are they going to let him go? Because they're convinced that a good whipping is all that it takes in order to settle these guys down and get them out of the people's hair. Then Paul does something very interesting. He says, hold on just a second. They've beaten us openly, and here is the stinger, uncondemned Romans. Now, what does he mean when he says Romans? What's he referring to? Was Paul a Roman? I thought he was a Jew. He is a Roman citizen. And how is he a Roman citizen? By what means? Right, he's going to say later on in Acts, via his testimony, that he was born of a Roman father, and that would make you a Roman citizen by birth. Okay. And they've thrown us into prison, and now they're going to just ask us to kindly sneak out? Not so fast. Let the big shots come themselves and get us out. Now, you got to be asking, what is Paul up to here? Why is he doing what he's doing? So the officers, the little shots, they come and tell the big shots, and the big shots are shaking in their boots. Okay? I mean, why are they shaking in their boots? I mean, they might even be doing more than that. But the reason that they're so shook up is because they know that if they mistreat a Roman citizen without a fair trial, they could be in danger of losing their own lives, at minimum their jobs, but they could even be executed. And that just reminds you of how secure you really were as a Roman citizen. I mean, the perks of being a Roman citizen were real. It really did make a difference. And I want to ask you two questions to consider here as we look at this text. Number one, why did Paul not reveal their citizenship when this all first happened? Why does he wait till now? And the second question to ask yourself is, why does he decide to expose his citizenship now? So those two questions, why didn't he expose it before? And why does he choose to expose it now? So just let that cook for a minute while we work into this next section. So the big shots come, and they pleaded with them, and they brought them out, and they asked them to depart from the city. In other words, basically they're saying, please, please, please don't tell on us. Please kindly leave. We made a mistake. We didn't know. We're so sorry. And the fact is, they didn't. Okay? They didn't tell on them. They didn't turn them in. What they did is they left the prison. They entered the house of Lydia. Remember the first European convert, as we call her, whose heart the Lord opened, right? Another evidence of God's sovereignty in salvation. And when they had seen the brethren, and they encouraged them, and finally they left. Now, did they leave the same day? Did they stay with her and her family that night and leave? We're not totally sure, but the idea is they didn't stay for very long. Made a quick visit, and then they were on their way. So, what do you think about those two questions? Why didn't Paul and Silas reveal their Roman citizenship back when this all broke out? And why do they decide to do it now? What do you think? Okay, all right, Sam, that's a really good answer. That's one of the answers I was looking for. If they had revealed their Roman citizenship when trouble came, a lot of the common people in the city who were not citizens could have deduced by that, oh, Christianity is really nice for those who have the convenience of Roman citizenship. But what about the rest of us? And by not playing that card, Paul was actually associating and being an example to everybody, Roman citizen or not. Really good. What else? Yes. Okay, and you just nailed another one. Paul's going to leave here. What's going to happen to this fledgling church when he's gone? Well, one thing you can be pretty sure of at this point is the big shots, the strategos, the magistrates, are not going to mess with the Philippian church for a very, very long time. Why? Because all that has to happen is word get back to Paul wherever he's traveling. Hey, they're messing with us. And Paul, oh, yeah. And he writes a letter to Rome and turns these guys in, and all of a sudden, they're toast. And so these guys are going to be very careful about how they treat this church, which means that the Philippian church, at least for the foreseeable future, is going to enjoy a measure of security. Okay? Anybody else? Good. Those are good answers. Anybody else have another idea as to why this may have happened? Actually, Sam used one word that kind of leads into the next one. That's the word example. Any other comments on that? Let me show you something here that I find interesting, and I'm not going to push this, but I do want to show it to you. You're all familiar with this very well-known passage in Philippians 2, probably the richest passage in the epistle. Remember, we're in Philippi. Later, Paul's going to write a letter. By the way, anytime you preach or teach from one of the epistles of the New Testament that is somehow identified in the book of Acts, it really helps to go back and look at the narrative first. If you're preaching from Ephesians, go back to Acts 19 and find out what happened in Ephesus. Because normally, reading the narrative will give you a little more baggage, a little more context, and perhaps even help you understand some of the passages in the epistle that might otherwise be difficult to understand. So I would encourage you to do that. But here, now just you read this, you all know what this says, and I want to share with you something. I read in an article. It's not my brainchild, but the article is there at the bottom. It's also in the files in your Canvas course. Look at this. Paul and Silas refused to exploit their Roman citizenship. Likewise, Jesus did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited. Paul and Silas willingly suffered humiliation of flogging and imprisonment at the hands of Roman magistrates. Jesus willingly suffered the humiliation of slave status and the crucifixion at the hands of a Roman magistrate, namely Pilate in this case. Paul and Silas were vindicated by a status reversal. In other words, now they're recognized as citizens, which changes the story altogether. And the oppressors, the magistrates, were shamed, came and begged them not to turn them in. Jesus was vindicated by a status reversal. He will be recognized as Lord, and now is by those who follow him. And as Philippians says, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God. I find that fascinating. I mean, I don't think there's any way the Philippian believers are going to receive this epistle and not remember what happened when Paul was there. That's going to be burned into their minds and hearts. And I'm not trying to equalize Paul and Silas with Jesus. But Paul did say in that same Philippian letter in chapter 3, I want to know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his suffering, being made conformable to his death. He wanted to reflect the person and the character of Christ. And that's what he and Silas did here. And what they did is very similar. It parallels what the Lord Jesus himself did when he gave up his position and he suffered humbly and willingly for us, and is now exalted and will be exalted by all when the books finally close. I think that's really cool. I think it's neat to see that example of Christ-likeness. So anyway, some things to think about as it relates to that passage. All right. Okay, this just froze on me. I think that was the last slide of that anyway, so let's get into chapter 17. Any quick questions regarding the end of chapter 16, what happened there at Philippi? Well, if not, let's jump into 17. Well, here's Luke. Now, visitors, we've all gotten used to the fact that Luke really isn't all that big on time, sometime, little time, much time, But when it comes to geography, he's very meticulous. So when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica. And I may have mentioned this before. I think one of the reasons why the Spirit of God moved him to be specific about geography is because there have been a lot of attacks on the veracity of the Gospel of Luke. And yet every time the attacks are considered in light of historical and geographical evidence, Luke comes out on top. So I think God did that at least in part in order to just show us that indeed this is stuff you can believe in. So here's the path. Okay, there's Philippi up here, and they're on, what's the name of this road they're on? Famous Roman road? The Ignatian Way, right. That's the little dotted road. So they passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia. Now, did they stop there and minister at all? They may have, but the text says, they went on to Thessalonica. So even if they did stop there, it must have been very brief, because the next significant visit that Luke mentions is Thessalonica, okay? Now, what is the capital of Macedonia? Okay, we're in the capital now. Remember, Philippi is called a chief city. because it was a favorite retirement place for military retirees. They had gold deposits there, nice climate, and all that. But now we're in the capital, Thessalonica, okay? And there was no synagogue, remember, in Philippi, apparently, because he didn't go there. And here there is a synagogue, and he's there for 3 Sabbaths. And he's reasoning with them from the scriptures. He's doing what he did before. He's explaining to them that Christ had to suffer and rise from the dead. And there's that theological stumbling block again right here. The resurrection of Christ, the biggest hurdle for these people to get over. And yet, what Old Testament passage makes it clear that the Messiah was to rise from the dead? Where do you go? It's one of Peter's texts on the day of Pentecost. Psalm 16, exactly. You will not leave my soul in the grave. And Peter goes on to explain that David was not talking about himself there, at least ultimately. Okay? All right. And if you're using the Christian Standard Bible, I'm guessing that in verse 3 there, it's Messiah instead of Christ. Anybody using the Christian Standard there? Is it Messiah? Yeah, and that's one of the things I like about the CSB. When it's a Jewish context, they'll translate Christos, Messiah. And this is a synagogue context, so that's pretty cool. Well, some are persuaded. Same kind of response you got in other places, okay? A great multitude of devout Greeks. Remember, the devout Greeks are probably Gentiles who are visiting the synagogue, at least looking into the possibility of Judaism and its claims, okay? Not a few leading women. Ladies, there you go. Lady leaders are heavily involved. We're going to see more of that as we move on. This is an era of history when women are beginning to come into their own in terms of leadership. That's not just something as a result of the 1920 women's suffrage movement and all that resulted. Okay. And some will tell you that these leading women were actually the wives of leading men, but the text doesn't say that. They may be, and we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of 17. And there are the passages on women. And, for what it's worth, if you've been following the news, aren't you glad that we can define women? Yeah, if you know what I mean. We can define men. Can you imagine somebody being considered for a post on the Supreme Court of the United States that cannot or will not define a woman? I mean, it just blows me away. There's no problem with that in the scriptures. So on your maps, let's add another chicken pox here, right there. So we did Philippi. Let's do Thessalonica, right here, the capital. You can see it's a coastal city, still exists today. So go ahead and add Thessalonica. Not Thessalonica, right, David? All right. Now, I put this one phrase in brackets because some older manuscripts don't mention it, but it really doesn't change the meaning at all. Obviously, the Jews who are envious of them are the unbelieving Jews. Some of them, they took. Do you remember the first time that we read in Acts about Jews being envious of the apostles? What group is envious of the apostles way back in the early chapters? Yeah, even broader, the Sanhedrin, which was really run by the Sadducees. They controlled it more than anybody else. Yeah, this is the problem. It's not they're theological. They're not concerned for their sheep. No, it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with their reputation and their position of influence in society. That's what's going on. So what do they go to the marketplace. Remember, we've said this before. You want to start up a riot of some sort? Go to the marketplace. There's lots of guys there that'll help you out. And so that's what they did. They gathered a mob. They set the city in an uproar and attacked the house of Jason. Now, who's Jason? Well, here's a new guy on stage here in Acts narrative. And we'll find out in just a second why they went after Jason. You probably already know the answer to that. But they're not there. They're not in the house of Jason. And so they dragged Jason and some of the other brethren to the rulers of the city. Now, this is yet another word. It's not either of the two words we saw in chapter 16. A study of the different levels of authority in the Roman world is a fascinating study. It's rather complicated. But I'm just telling you, this is another word that has to do with kind of a city official of some sort, okay? And they're crying out, these who have turned the world upside down have come here also. Wouldn't you like to have that reputation? If somebody's going to attack you, wouldn't you like to hear him say that? These guys are turning the world upside down. That's exactly what we want to happen, okay, in the right way. And that's what's going on here. This is really neat. And so, they're here now, and so Jason has harbored them. There's why Jason comes into the picture. He hosted these guys. Why did he? Was he a Christian? We don't know. He was at least sympathetic to them. That much we can say. He's harbored them, and these are all acting contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying there's another King Jesus. Now, was that right? Was that accusation accurate? Were they preaching another King Jesus? Well, yeah. Jesus is king. He's exalted at the right hand of God. What's the problem? What is faulty about what they're saying here? What's not true? By implication. Yeah. Yeah, they're almost saying these guys are revolutionaries. They're presenting another Jesus that's going to shake up the Roman world and turn them against Caesar. It's the same exact thing they did to Jesus. Pilate looked at Jesus, are you a king? And what did Jesus say in response? Do you remember? John 18. My kingdom. Remember those words of Jesus? My kingdom is not of this world. He acknowledged he was a king, but his kingship was not intended to dethrone Caesar. You see, and that's what these guys are trying to imply. It's the good old press again, the media, taking something, and it has an element of truth, but twisting it to make it say what they want it to say. All right, so they troubled the crowd and the rulers of the city when they heard these things. So what happens? Well, this is what's left. We don't have a whole lot of archaeology left in the city of Thessalonica. That looks like a fairly small amphitheater compared to the Caesarean one, for example, that we looked at earlier. But if you go there to visit, you can at least have a seat there and enjoy the view. And so when they had taken security, what's security? What'd they take from Jason? It's a bribe. It's amazing how much money gets things done, how much money can resolve things. It's really what they want. When we get to Ephesus, in chapter 19, you're going to see the same thing. Money is going to become the main issue there. Fascinating. And so they let him go. And so immediately the brethren sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. Now, remember, there are other times in the narrative when Paul and Silas decided to stay. Remember back in Iconium, it says that when things got hot, for that very reason, they decided to stay there. But now they're not. So how do we know when they should stay and when they shouldn't? Or better, how would they know that? Well, all we can say is that the Spirit of God is leading them in using all the circumstances and people in going on in that context to direct them. It's not always as objective as they'd like it to be. But the brethren felt that they needed to leave. And by the way, in the world of missions, this is a very fascinating conversation. When persecution or, let's say, civil war breaks out in a country where missionaries are serving, how do the missionaries know where they should stay or leave? There are several schools of thought. Some think, well, if you leave, you're going to discourage the people because you're running scared. But others will say, if you stay, you're just drawing attention as Americans to exactly what we don't want to draw attention to. And so if you get out of there, you're actually helping the church by leaving. So it isn't always as easy as we'd like to make it out to be. There have been fields where some missionaries have left and others have stayed, and for different reasons. And they've drawn different conclusions. Who's right and who's wrong? That's a tough one to say. Okay? But if you're walking in the Spirit of God, and trusting God, He will direct you. And that's what's happening. I like the variety of the way things happen in Acts. It's a good reminder that God doesn't always lead in the same way in every circumstance. Okay? So out they go. Now, that red line going across the map is the Ignatian Way. And what I want to show you here is that for the first time in the narrative and in the second journey, they're leaving that route. And that yellow arrow there is approximately where Berea is located. And you can see that it's slightly south of the Ignatian Way. If they had stayed on the Ignatian Way, they would end up heading over here to Dyrrachium, where they could catch a kayak and go across to Italy, and then eventually go to Rome. Okay, but you see, God has placed on Paul a little different strategy, and we'll see where that takes him. You already know. So these Bereans were more fair-minded. Some translators say more noble, but the idea here is that rather than just draw hasty conclusions and kick these guys out and get jealous of them or whatever. They say, hold on. Let's take a look at what they're saying. Let's go home and examine these scriptures and be careful about drawing hasty conclusions. Now, why did they do that when other synagogues didn't? Well, remember, the synagogues were not prescribed by God. They're an invention of the Jews, a good one. And every synagogue was a little different. Some synagogues allowed men and women to sit on the same side. Others didn't. Some synagogues allowed the Septuagint, the Greek text, to be read. Others didn't. We're going to use the Hebrew scriptures. And so the structure of every synagogue was slightly different. This one was led by individuals who were very wise in this way. So kind of like Gamaliel saying, wait a minute, not so fast. Let's examine what they said in light of our scriptures and see if they're telling the truth. That was great. And Luke makes an issue here of pointing that out. And you guys who are going to be pastors have all heard that, Don't ever feel threatened if your people, take your sermon text and go home and look it over and come back with a question. Say, hey, Pastor, you said this morning, but I'm seeing here, don't feel threatened by that, okay? Thank the Lord for it. Thank the Lord for people who are willing to take your message and run with it instead of just forgetting about it when they leave church. All right, so what happens as a result of examining the scriptures, right? Look what happens. Many of them believed. Also, not a few of the Greeks, prominent women, there's the women again, as well as men. And again, these women are not necessarily the wives of these men. It doesn't state that as such, and we shouldn't draw that conclusion. Wow. Well, now what happens? Okay, remember the first journey? When Paul and Barnabas went to Lystra, where Timothy's from, who showed up to stir the people up against them? Jews from where? Do you remember that? This is back in the first journey. Where were they from? Yeah, just a little ways away. The two previous cities they had visited, Iconium and Antioch in Pisidia. So, and we made comment at that time that those Jews were not satisfied that they had left their cities. They wanted them out of the region, out of the province altogether. And that's what's happening here. They're still in Macedonia. And the Jews in Thessalonica don't want them anywhere in the province, period. And so they stir up the crowds there in Berea. Now, something unusual and unique happens here at this point, okay? And that is they send Paul away by himself. By the way, one thing we didn't mention at the end of chapter 16 is that the we passages that started when Paul arrived in Troas, actually, and then went on to Philippi, those we passages cease at the end of Acts 16. And so what do we conclude? Well, who's part of the we that would be saying we? Luke. So what's our conclusion? Luke stayed behind at Philippi while the rest of them went on. Okay, so starting in Acts 17 and moving forward until you get to chapter 20, when Paul goes back to Philippi at the end of his third journey, it's all they. And then the we will come back when he visits Philippi years later. So now we're kind of under the impression that it's Paul and Silas and Timothy. In fact, the text is going to confirm that. Why do they take Paul away by himself here? We don't know. We can make a couple of stabs at it, and I'll give you something just to chew on. Notice those who conducted Paul to Athens. I'm going to show you here. Okay, they received a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him with all speed. And they departed. So look at the map. This is a quantum leap. They've been leapfrogging from place to place, but now all of a sudden it's from Berea all the way down to Athens. Why Athens? I don't know. Are there no other major cities along the way? Of course there are. Lots and lots of them. Okay? But again, God is putting things in Paul's mind, a strategy, and I really believe that all along he's wanted to go here. You guys who've studied Western civilization, you know that there are 3 cities in Europe that are considered absolutely essential to understand the growth and development of Western civilization. And they are Rome, Athens. Well, Athens is in Greece. Greece is not a city in this case. Okay, it's right, you got the right. And you might not consider this part of Europe, Jerusalem, because of the impact that Judeo-Christianity had in the Roman Empire. See, so I really have to believe that Paul has wanted to get to Athens. He's been to Jerusalem. He's going to end up in Athens here, and then eventually he'll land in Rome. Okay, so maybe one of the reasons they sent Paul alone was for financial reasons, because it probably costs a bit of money to ship him down to Athens. And some went with him. They accompanied him down there, dropped him off, and then when they dropped him off, he said, hey, be sure to tell Silas and Timothy to come whenever they can. Another possible explanation is that Paul was the real hot spot in the opposition, and so by getting him out of there, maybe they thought, okay, Silas and Timothy can remain there and continue to minister to the people without creating the same havoc that they just encountered. Okay, so again, the text doesn't tell us, but there are some reasonable deductions that we could make regarding their motive for sending him alone. So back to your map, another zit will be right there, and that's Berea. And the Ignatian Way is not on here, but just remember they're slightly south of the Ignatian Way at this point. And while we're at this map, go ahead and throw Athens in there too. Okay, there's Athens right down there. All right, so you got Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, Athens. Okay, we are making such good progress. Let's go on. So, what did Athens, CD. We were making good progress. No, I'm just kidding. I love questions. Go ahead. You want the map back? Okay. So sorry. Yeah. What did Athens look like back then? There are lots of descriptions. Obviously, if you've studied ancient Athens, one of the things you got to keep in mind is that, well, when was Athens really at its heyday? When was the peak of Athenian fame? Yeah. Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you. When was Athens at its peak? The time of what?
In the time of the Greeks?
Well, yes. I mean, they're still considered a Greek culture, even in Paul's day, even though it's a Roman Empire now. But you're right. But who are the famous Greeks that we would associate with Athens? Well, okay. Yeah, he kind of got the Greek Empire rolling. Yeah. But Athens goes back even before him a little bit. He was around 330 or so. Yeah, you go back to Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, those guys. You're going back another, 60, 80, 100 years before even Alexander. That's the heyday of Rome, okay, these philosophical giants, if you will, and at least supposed giants. And so when Paul arrives there, here in probably around, we're probably in the neighborhood of 51 or 2 AD, it's already declined a lot as a city. And, the great Athenian democratic experience took place, well before this, and some of you've studied that. Who's the statue of there? Athena, the goddess, the patron of Greece. You've got the Parthenon there, which means, all the gods. I'm sorry, no, not Parthenon. Pantheon is all the gods in Rome. Parthenon actually means virgin, and it has to do with the story of Athena and all of that. There's a lot tied into that, and this is what it looks like today. A lot of reconstruction, restoration work has gone into the city, and I think that this picture was taken from Mars Hill, Areopagus, looking up at the Parthenon, the Acropolis up there, the high city. All right. So anyway, Paul's here, and look, you think, ooh, this is such a neat place for tourists to go. But when Paul starts walking around the city, anything but tourist fury, strikes him. What strikes him is the absolute idolatry, the dedication to idolatry in this city. It's totally given over. It's the only place in the New Testament that states it that way, just completely given over to idolatry. So, what's he do? He starts in the synagogue, just like before, okay? Jews and Gentiles, nothing new here, and the marketplace. Now, why would he go to the marketplace in Athens? Because he wants to start a riot, and that's where you find a bunch of guys to start a riot, right? As Paul says, my turn to start a riot now. I've always been the brunt of it. I'm going to be the instigator this time, right? No, that's not Paul, okay? And by the way, there are people in ministry who have unwittingly started riots, okay? Don't do that. Paul doesn't go to the marketplace to find rabble-rousers. There was a rule in Athens, and that rule was you are not allowed to peddle any new religion or philosophy unless you have authorization from the city fathers. Now, who are the city fathers? And by the way, mothers too, because there were some women on this. They were philosophers, and they were part of what they called the Areopagus, which is the Greek for Mars Hill. Okay, it's a big old rock that's there. I think we'll show a picture later. And as history goes, as legend goes, you know, the god Mars was tried for war crimes on that hill, and that's why it became known as Mars Hill. It was a place of judgment, but it was also a place where a council of Athenian philosophers would meet to interview anybody that wanted to introduce a new religious or philosophical idea. Well, Paul wanted that opportunity, apparently, because you couldn't just walk up to Mars Hill and say, oh, excuse me, I have a new religion. I'd like to tell you about it. Now, this had to be very formally scheduled, not just any Tom, Dick, or Harry could go up there and espouse his religion. And so where do you start? You start in the marketplace. You find a place in the corner there, you stand up on a little box or a rock, and you start spewing your religion or your philosophy, and you may draw a crowd. And if you draw a big enough crowd and people get really excited, it may catch the attention of the leaders, and they may say, let's give this guy a chance to tell us a little more about this. And that's exactly what happens. Who does Paul meet in the marketplace? Well, Epicureans and Stoics. So I won't ask who has studied philosophy here yet, because I don't want you to feel like you're on the spot. But can somebody tell me basically what an Epicurean was? Yes, Edie. Oh, all right. Okay, all right. Very much given to joy, ecstasy, that sort of thing. One of the things we need to be careful of is that we don't just assume that they were all a bunch of immoral, womanizers and things like that. I mean, that was involved too. But they were very, very much nature worshipers. They believed in this idea of oneness with nature, nothing new under the sun, right? And so their idea of joy was the idea of becoming one with nature and enjoying all that has to offer, okay? Almost kind of like a Taoism idea today, where you just let be what will be, let everything flow, and join into the natural world and relax and enjoy. So that was the Epicurean idea, and of course named after a guy named Epicurus. And what about the Stoics? Who are they? Yeah. Yeah. You ever heard of a Stoic person? That's the person that just seems to be really neutral emotionally, right? Yeah, the Stoics believed that self-denial, self-beating and things like that, self-abnegation was the key to becoming a rich person. And so they would do just the opposite. They would deny themselves certain things. Do you remember why they're called Stoics, where the word Stoic came from, by chance, from your studies? It's super simple. It has to do with where they meet. Well, a stoa is a column. They would meet in colonnaded places. You just look at Athens, there were columns everywhere. You look at Greek architecture, it's fascinating. So they would meet under a cover of areas full of columns, pillars, stoas, and they gained a reputation as Stoics because of that. Okay, anyway, 2 prominent groups. Now, I'm guessing that there are people in both these groups who are part of the council, okay, that meets on Mars Hill, and they're out checking this guy out. Apparently, Paul is drawing quite a crowd, which shouldn't surprise us. That's happened everywhere he's gone. What does babbler say? Okay, what's the babbler mean? You remember that word? It has to do with a little something with wings. Do you remember studying that somewhere? There was a little bird that used to fly around the marketplace and it would pick up McDonald's French fries and popcorn and things that people dropped, and they were called seed pickers, and that's exactly the word he uses here. Paul sounds like one of these seed pickers. He's got a little bit of this, a little over here, a little here, a little here, a little here. He's kind of throwing together a whole bunch of philosophic and religious ideas to come up with this weird new potion, this concoction of foreign gods. Notice plural, because he preached to them Jesus and the resurrection. So they're totally confused. They don't get it at all at this point, but he has snagged their attention. And so, woohoo, they took him up. Now, he makes it sound very simple, but it was a process where they would have to actually appear before this council on Mars Hill and either read their text or memorize it and quote it. They weren't allowed to get up and just ramble. It was very, very controlled, the environment on Mars Hill. And so Paul had to take some time to write. Anybody here ever been to Athens? I have not. I was one of these days, I would love to go to Greece, love it. If you go up to Mars Hill today, you'll find something very interesting at the base of the stairway. I'll show you in just a second. So we want to know this new doctrine of which you speak. Is it really possible that in Athens, the place that's completely given over to idolatry, that somebody could come up with a new doctrine? I mean, think about it today. How easy would it be for you to come up with a brand new doctrine today that nobody else has ever thought of? Pretty hard. This world is so chock full of, and that's kind of the way you would think Athens was like. And yet, there's something new. And what is it? What's the doctrine that they just mentioned that's really presenting the newness of this? The resurrection. The resurrection. Their God died and rose again. That's weird. We ain't never heard nothing like that before. So you're bringing some strange things to our ears. We want to know what these things mean. Good. So the application in evangelism here is be as mixed up and get people as confused as possible, and that will generate their interest in the gospel. No, I don't think that's the point here. Paul wasn't trying to mix them up. He's trying to be very clear, but their heads were swimming with so much diversity in philosophy and religion that they were confused. For all the Athenians and foreigners who were there spent their time in nothing else but either to tell or hear some new thing. Now, some people have used that as a criticism. I think that there's actually an element worth pondering in this statement. Why would they be constantly wanting to know or hear some new thing? What do you think? Yeah. They're still hungry. I mean, they're exposed to so many options. The menu is huge, and yet nothing is satisfying their souls. And so they're still out there looking for something. Maybe you've been there or you know people like that, and they've tried everything, and yet their souls are still empty. And I think that is part of the and that I also believe is part of the reason why they made a statue to the unknown God, as we'll see in a moment. Part of that may be because they don't want to offend a God that they may have forgotten by accident, because the gods could be easily angered, but it also may represent their desire to find something that is for real, and they just haven't come across that yet. All right. So that's Mars Hill down there, the big rock, looking from the Acropolis. Remember the last picture was the other way around, looking up from Mars Hill. It's just big old ugly rock, but there's a stairway down there in the lower left, see right there, where you can go up. And again, one of these days I'd love to go up there. Now, there are some commentators that believe that by Paul's day, they were already meeting in a different location, that they had already stopped meeting at that particular place even before the first century. But that's debated. And even if they are, they still could have called it Areopagus, even if they had moved the location. So we'll not worry about it. Yeah, there it is. There's a little closer. And as you can see, tourists are certainly allowed to go there. And here at the bottom of the stairs is a bronze plaque. And guess what is etched on that plaque? Yeah, the message that Paul is about to deliver. Isn't that cool? In modern Greek, I think, I don't know for sure. It may be in Koine Greek from the first century, but it may be in modern Greek. I don't know. But Paul's message in Greek from Acts 17 is right there for everybody to see. I'm assuming it's in the Greek language. Maybe I shouldn't be so quick. Yeah, it is. It is. My eyes aren't that good, but I can see that. They're all in caps. All right, now, Paul gets up, and the first thing he says, men of Athens, I perceive in all things you're very religious. Some say, superstitious. He's not slamming them, okay? He's acknowledging the fact that they are sensitive to spiritual things. They just are. That's the reason that he caught their attention in the first place. So this is not a slam, okay? It's an acknowledgement that they're interested in spiritual things, and he has something spiritual to talk to them about, okay? He's very polite. As I was passing through and considering the object of your worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. Again, that may be, in order not to offend any, gods that were not represented, but it also may be a confession of their search for truth. And archaeologists tell us that other cities besides Athens also had similar statues to unknown gods. So this is not unique to the city of Athens itself. But I'm going to tell you about this God. Now, how many people have come up there and done that? I don't know. I don't know if anybody had ever done that before. But Paul says, this is the God that I want to proclaim to you. So he's taking something there in the context, of the city, and he has the background of having walked through the city and seen all the idolatry. So Paul is well prepared. And one of the things I want to point out to you is that Paul uses the context where he is in order to launch his message. He's taking advantages of things that are part of their life and religion to connect with them. And that's a really cool thing that we all should try to do. All right. Remember back in Acts 14, where was it that Paul preached a message that was very, very similar to this one? What city? Yeah. No, Perga is where they landed when they came up from Cyprus. Then they went up to Antioch. Was it there? No. Then they went to Iconium. Was it there? Oh. Then where'd they go from Iconium? Lystra, where Timothy's from. And that's where Paul preached a very similar message. Remember we looked at that last week? Then they go to Derbe and then head back. So, okay, what's the dominant doctrine here? What is Paul focusing on? What doctrinal theme here? Think of the 10 doctrines you study, or 9. Yeah. Theology proper. Same thing he did in Lystra. God, singular, who made the world and everything in it. They're thinking gods, one God made this, another God made that, another God did this, another God did that, God, this, that, and the other thing. And Paul says, no. It's all together. It's not that complicated. There is a God, singular, who did it all. Because if you don't start there, as we said last time in Lystra, these people are going to conceptualize adding one more God to their already huge collection of gods. And Paul wants to avoid that. So he begins. See, this is very important. When you enter a culture that's different from your own, first thing you have to do is analyze what's their concept of God and truth. And when you present the gospel to them, you need to present it using a vehicle that identifies with where they are spiritually. You don't change the gospel, okay? The content of the gospel never changes, but the way that you present it, the context, the vehicle that you use to present the gospel, the starting point, the first doctrines that you emphasize are going to vary depending on where you are. And in a polytheistic context, he starts with monotheism. There's one God, and he tells them about this God, who he is and what he's done. Okay? And we will have to wait and go on from there next time because we're out of time. Visitors, thanks for joining us. Students, we'll see you on Wednesday next week.